Today is Monday, January 10th. This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today is the first day of the winter term in the academy, so it's exciting to see the kids getting back to work today. CLAA is in a great place heading into 2022, and I'm very excited about this coming year, or the year that's already begun now. Yesterday, I gave a talk that was titled Reverse Engineering and Homeschooling. Reverse Engineering and Homeschooling. I talked about how people who are real master problem solvers start by looking at a problem, figuring out what needs to be done. That is, establishing, at least in their minds, what the solution is that's needed. And then they use a process called reverse engineering to work backward from the solution to the actual processes and methods and means by which that solution will be produced. I used Elon Musk as an example of one who is extraordinary at this work of problem solving in our generation. And I explained that many homeschool parents fail to look at education in this same way and understand that if we don't have clear goals, we can't work backwards to establish a plan for education. And this is where I would argue most homeschool parents stand. If you were to challenge them with some questions about the goals for their children's education, the answers would be inappropriate. They'd be unreasonable. They'd be unrealistic. And they wouldn't really have anything to do with the work of education. Education is a human activity, and therefore the goals of education need to be goals that are within human reach. In the ancient world, wise men and doctors of the church and saints pursued reasonable goals in education, and they developed a system of education that allowed those goals to be reached again and again and again. They were reproducible solutions. The problem through history with regard to education was that the way that society was arranged, the way that economies worked, the way that families worked, there weren't many children who could afford to receive an education. And so it was considered a privilege of the upper classes, and occasionally a poorer child who had extraordinary intellectual gifts might be recognized by someone in the community and sponsored, the equivalent of a modern scholarship, sponsored so that his intellectual gifts might be put to good use. And this was true not only of free people, but also of slaves at times. Cicero, for example, the famous Roman philosopher, had a servant who was highly educated, who later in his life Cicero actually freed. And he helped Cicero and actually contributed to a lot of Cicero's writings through the years. But education was considered a privilege, and not many people enjoyed that privilege. When modern educators look back on the past and they see that illiteracy was common, they imagine that people in the ancient world couldn't figure out how to teach reading. And they imagine that today we're just so smart because we have so many people who learn the ability to read, whereas we simply devote hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to the education of American citizens. And it's an investment that our country makes with no real accountability to show that the investment we're making actually yields any benefits. The fact that many people in our society can read or learn to read doesn't mean that they actually do read or that they live like literate people. The problem in the past was not that medieval or ancient teachers couldn't figure out how to teach reading. They simply didn't think it was necessary. They thought that it was necessary for those who needed to do literary work, and others could learn it if they wished to, but it wasn't necessary. If a man was going to be a farmer, it was more important that he learned to work. If a man was going to be a carpenter, it was more important that he learned to work. And so those destined for trades were sent to apprentice and learn the trades. And those who were destined for what were called the learned professions were sent to schools. The classical liberal arts curriculum, therefore, was capable of teaching all students, but all students simply didn't go to schools. And the apparent prevalence of education and literacy in modern society is not a sign of a better educational model or system. It's simply the result of a different economy, a different political system. And as I said, the end results are not necessarily different. They're simply a different process, and we can boast that some things are made available, but in the long run, it really doesn't change anything. These wise men in history established the best system of education for human beings. It was called the liberal arts because they were the arts, not, as some say, arts that make man free. That's not what the liberal arts are. That sounds cute, and it's probably good for marketing some classical school materials, but that's not what the liberal arts were. The liberal arts were arts that were unrelated to money-making. They were unrelated to what's called servile labor, the kind of labor that's forbidden on Sundays. The liberal arts were arts that were studied and practiced for the service of learned professions, for religion, for philosophy, for politics, for higher arts, arts that have to do with the human soul. Remember, the principle of ancient philosophy was know thyself, and what that meant was that a man should understand that he's not an animal. He's not an irrational animal, I should say, but that he is a rational animal. That's what he is. That's his definition. And if a man knows that he is a rational animal, he should live like a rational animal and not like the irrational animals, which we call beasts in natural philosophy. The liberal arts was the system of education for men who desired to fulfill their capacity as rational animals and seek a truly human education, one that wasn't necessarily concerned with earning money or making a living or producing something to sell or trade for something else. Wisdom was taught by Aristotle to be the highest end. Solomon, writing in the Proverbs, says that wisdom is superior to gold, silver, or any other riches. The liberal arts are the arts that lead a man to this highest and truest wealth, the fulfillment of human potential as a rational animal. And they distinguish themselves from what were called the illiberal arts, which are the arts that are pursued for the sake of some other end, some end other than wisdom itself. Illiberal arts would be things like shipbuilding, carpentry, stone masonry, sculpting, weaving, any kind of mechanical art. No one makes a table as an end in itself. No one builds a ship as an end in itself. No one weaves a blanket as an end in itself. These are illiberal arts. Arts that are pursued for the sake of something else, something inferior to wisdom. They're the servile arts. So that's what the classical liberal arts are. If you're interested in making money, you're not interested in the liberal arts. It's that simple. If you're interested in wisdom, if you're interested in virtue, then you need to learn the liberal arts. In modern education, liberal arts as a phrase is simply used to name whatever studies aren't included in the science and math or STEM programs. Whatever doesn't qualify as a modern science, whatever doesn't qualify as a mathematical science, whatever doesn't qualify as technology or any kind of research-based modern scientific study is simply lumped in with all other studies that are called liberal arts. But that's not what the ancient liberal arts were. They were the arts pursued as ends in themselves, pursued for the sake of wisdom. And the reason why only the wealthy could study the liberal arts was because they didn't have pressure on them to find out how they were going to earn a living. The reason why religious would study the liberal arts was because by taking vows of poverty, they also had no concerns about obtaining material wealth. And so they were free, not in any sort of political sense, but they were free from the care of financial pressures, free to seek wisdom. So one could enjoy that freedom because he inherited wealth, as many famous ancient people did, who we know about through their classical liberal arts studies and work in philosophy and things like that. Or they could choose simply to be poor voluntarily. which was considered to be the way of the philosopher, the way of the ancient prophet, the way of the ancient wise man, the way of the contemplative, the way of, in the Christian era, the way of the religious, whether he's a hermit or a monk. By taking vows of voluntary poverty, he freed himself from any concern for financial gain and freed himself for the study of the quote-unquote liberal arts. So the term liberal has much more to do with finances and economics than it does with any kind of political freedom. So having said that, I want to make it clear that the true goals of education were laid down by the wise men and saints who studied and taught the classical liberal arts. And those arts aimed at reasonable goals for education. And most parents who are concerned about the education of their children are actually not interested in those goals, and that's part of the problem. That's why in the 21st century we have no religious vocations. We don't see young adult men and women choosing religious life because, to be frank, our society doesn't understand that life that I talked about, that life of freedom from the cares of this life, freedom from love of money, freedom from covetousness, freedom from worldly ambition, freedom from a simple, vulgar desire for possessions and comforts and pleasures of this life. Our society has a very difficult time understanding life apart from those materialistic ends. And that's why we have no religious vocations. That's why we have no studies of philosophy. That's why modern schools are oriented around science labs and math classes, because we're all concerned about money and how we're going to make enough money. Even in my own family, my children grew up constantly talking about money, even though they'd never heard anything like that from me. In fact, I live quite a contrary to life to the idea of working for the sake of money. I hardly ever make decisions based on monetary concerns. Money in my life has always taken care of itself. And it seems that in my experience, the more I ignore financial concerns, the more generously the Lord provides for me. I don't think it works the way people think it works, and I think that the penalty that men suffer is that they think that you'll make more money by giving more attention to it, when in fact the opposite is more true. And I'm not saying we should pursue philosophical studies for some hope of becoming materially wealthy, but I think that God provides for those who seek wisdom, provides sufficiently for their needs and all of their responsibilities. But the only way to learn that is to seek wisdom with no concern for those things, trusting that one who devotes himself to contemplation, who lives in simplicity, a life of voluntary poverty, and who zealously labors for wisdom will never lack anything in this life. Man is a rational animal. He's created to work, but not like an ox, not like a mule. He's created to work like a man through the exercise of reason. So the reason that I spent 20 minutes talking about this was because in the last talk I gave, I talked about reverse engineering and homeschooling, and I criticized parents for not having realistic goals. And the goals, you may say, sounded like they were spiritual, and here I am now criticizing materialistic goals. And that's right, I'm criticizing both. I'm criticizing exclusively materialistic goals, which we find in most modern circles, because there's no end to money making and spending. There's no end. If we don't learn to embrace voluntary poverty or simplicity, there's no end to the spending. There's no end to the self-indulgence or the home decorating or the vacationing or the food, the fine eating and dining. There's no end to these things. How would anyone ever be satisfied? We choose to either live simply or we end up on an endless pursuit of some kind of satisfaction that will never come. But the alternative is not a false and overly simplified Sunday school religion where we just mouth or parrot things that appear to be spiritual, but upon examination are found to not even make any sense. Only God can give our children the grace that they need to be saved. That's not the work of education. The goal of education is to be wise and to be able to fulfill one's vocation. That's the true goal of education. That vocation is not left for man to choose for himself, but is more or less mapped out for him by God. And there's a hierarchy in terms of excellence that God leaves man to choose from, and based on his own virtue, his own faith and hope and charity, a man can choose a more or less excellent vocation. It doesn't mean that a man is sinning in choosing the inferior vocation, but there are consequences. And I wrote an article some time ago titled "The Consequences of Secular Occupations." We want to raise children who are wise and capable of fulfilling their vocation. And yet we live in the 21st century, and things don't work the way that they did in other generations. And to sit around and pretend that you're going to live like someone who lived in the 1200s or in the 1500s is just to be a weirdo. We live by the will of God in the 21st century. We're born into a society that works a certain way, that operates and is arranged in a certain way, and we need to live within that system. Certainly there's opportunity for reform in that system, but unless God's providence grants We're not to seek some kind of revolution and overthrow of the system under which we live. And so when we consider that we're born in America under a constitutional democracy for government that's separated into different branches of power and then into different levels of local and state and federal government, we're born into a competitive, capitalistic economy that is very meritocratic even today. We have to learn how to balance the timeless goals of classical liberal education with the temporal goals of living well within our own generation, in our own society, as members of our own community. And finding this balance is a problem that can only be solved by those who are willing to address the problem directly, identify the solutions, and then reverse engineer to create the educational plan that can lead students to the fulfillment of the goals that solve that problem. Very few Christians are willing to engage with this problem. Most of them simply try to imitate what other people have done in other cultures at other times under other circumstances, and they just sort of act like Christians living at a different period of time. They're acting. They're not living in their own generation. They're pretending to be characters from books and movies. They're pretending to be someone living somewhere that they're not. And they're ignoring the problems of their own generation that need to be solved. And this is what I criticize in modern Christian education. For example, if we look at modern schools, we find schools that are simply maintaining an assembly line type system of public education that was invented by a different generation. That doesn't work. And yet, because the financial apparatus is in place and it's become such a massive institution, it's a place where people can go to serve as assembly line workers, get a paycheck, and all they've got to do is keep the assembly line moving. Many people choose to just go and accept one of those spots. They're called teachers, but they really aren't teaching anything. They're simply operators, like workers on an assembly line. And there are Christians who look at that and they think of all of the problems of the modern public school system, and they say, no, I'm not going to do that. We're going to create our own private school. And in our private school, we're going to more perfectly pursue what we might consider Christian goals in education. But all that they do is they clone the modern school system and make some superficial changes that allow them to call it a Christian school. What makes it a private school is simply that it's tuition funded rather than tax funded. So that's the first challenge, is that the parents have to pay the bills for these schools to operate. The schools, like I said, are simply clones of the public school system with superficial improvements. We may add religion classes to the school. We may add religious ceremony to the school. We rarely find that the schools limit attendance to those who are members of a particular religious community. We, especially among the faculty, we find that often the schools don't even require that teachers be of a certain religious persuasion. And as I said, the differences are superficial. For some people, it's enough. Some people simply think that by sending their children to a school where parents have to pay tuition, it'll be a better crowd of kids. It won't just be the public school rabble off the streets in the public school, but it will be kids whose parents can pay tuition, and that should put the private school kids in better company. And that's usually true. And so the private schools, like I said, they change some of the elements of the public school system, but they really are just a copy or clone of a public school with some superficial improvements. Academically, we could say the private schools do a little bit better, but it's not a fair comparison. We're not comparing apples to apples. The public schools are obligated to serve any student who shows up at the front door. And I've talked about this quite a bit. The public schools are serving children whose parents may be dead, whose parents may be drug addicts, whose parents may be in prison. And so any Christian person, any homeschool or private school person who compares the scores or achievements of public schools to their private school or homeschool is just nuts. We should never compare our achievements to the public schools. The public schools are providing a public service. They serve any student who shows up. I remember in first grade, my public school first grade teacher used to bring clothes in for some of the kids in my class. My public school teachers provided breakfast for kids who came to school early, who didn't have food at home. They weren't primarily concerned with SAT scores and academic achievements. They were usually moved by concerns for social justice and just a general sense of care for human beings and wanting to help. And they did as much as they could academically, but there were other things that they were concerned about. So to compare private school achievements or homeschool achievements to public schools is just ridiculous. And anybody who does that should be ashamed that they would even try to manipulate or mislead people by advertising their numbers or scores and comparing them to public school numbers. Criticizing public schools because their numbers are lower. What should concern us is not that public school numbers are low, but what should concern us is that the private school and homeschool numbers aren't much higher. That's even more confusing. But some parents will pull their kids away from public schools and send them to private schools for reasons that I mentioned before. But some parents will look at these private schools and say, no, I don't think the private school goes far enough. I don't think it's, let's take Catholic schools for example. Parents will say, I really don't think that this Catholic school does enough to teach the Catholic faith. The teachers aren't even required to be Catholics. The students in the school aren't even necessarily Catholics. There's all kinds of reports in the community about bad behavior among the students. Kids in the Catholic high school drink and party and fool around just like other kids do. I don't care that it's called a Catholic school. I don't care that it's called a private school. I don't think it goes far enough. I'm going to homeschool my children. And so what these parents do is they simply clone the public school curriculum and plan to do the same thing at home that the public school is doing with none of the resources. And it never works. An example of this is in Seton Home Study, which is the largest Catholic homeschool program. It's been around since the 1980s. And on their website, they advertise that their average SAT score is 1149. 1149. So if I sign up for a Seton Home Study, I'm told that it's a Catholic program, even though the curriculum aligns exactly with the modern public school curriculum, which is a coincidence, I guess. And I'm told that if I give my children this homeschool education, which costs thousands of dollars and requires a parent to be with the children, an enormous investment. We have to acknowledge what a great investment homeschooling is for a family. Usually it requires the family to live on a single income. Mom usually has to dedicate herself to homeschooling, or hopefully she does. So there are many, many sacrifices that need to be made for a family to homeschool, and to think of going through that, spending thousands and thousands of dollars on curriculum materials, going through this whole K through 12 grade system, using all of these homeschool books, with mom working for over a decade to guide a child through this program, and then to think that at the end of that, Seton advertises that their average SAT score is 1149. And then to show that the average national SAT score is 1050. And to know that the difference between the national average SAT score and the Seton average SAT score is 100 points. A decade of work, possibly living on a single income, spending thousands of dollars on curriculum materials, and the end result, academically speaking, is 100 points over the national average. It's terrible, to be honest, considering what a mother would have to invest over so many years and so many thousands of dollars sacrificed. And to show a difference of 100 points on the SAT, if you sign up for the Princeton Review your junior or senior year of high school, they guarantee you a 100-point increase in your score just by going through one of their courses. You're telling me that homeschooling has the academic effect of a Princeton Review SAT prep course. It's terrible. It's terrible. But Seton will advertise and compare their SAT scores, 1149, to the national average, 1050, and say, look at that. We're better than them. We're better. And that's a terrible comparison. Think of what you're saying. Think of what you're comparing. It's terrible. Homeschooling is a form of private schooling. Homeschooling is not a form of public schooling. Parents in a homeschool care only for their own children. It's a form of private schooling. And therefore, if we want to evaluate the academic effect of homeschooling, we need to compare homeschooling to private schooling. That's a more reasonable comparison. Anytime we want to evaluate homeschooling, we need to compare it with private schooling. And if we do, things don't look very good. Again, looking at the SAT scores, the average Seton score is 1149. The national average for private schools is 1229. 1229. That's 80 points better than the Seton homeschoolers. The private schools are almost 200 points higher than the public schools, and they're 80 points higher than the homeschoolers. And so for the criticism of the private schools among the homeschoolers, the results don't show that the homeschoolers do a better job. And after all, they're simply cloning the public school program, all the same system, K to 12, first grade, second grade, third grade, all the dopey subjects and books. They're doing exactly what the public schools do, changing things superficially, but producing worse results than the private schools. And that at great expense to the family. Now, the problem that I have with the modern homeschool program, the modern Catholic homeschool program, a program like Seton, is that Seton tells a parent that if you use their curriculum, you'll be able to achieve the goals of modern education while also giving your children a Catholic education. But really what we see is that Seton does neither of these two things. They do neither. Neither are your students well prepared academically. They're not prepared as well as they would if you would send them to a private school. Nor do they actually study what historically was a Catholic education. They actually do neither. It's simply a public school curriculum superficially changed to appear, literally, to appear to be a Catholic study program. But it's really not. Substantially, it's not. If we wanted to pursue a Catholic study program, we would go back to the educational system established by the doctors and saints of the Church, which existed for 1850 years before any K-12 public school grade system ever existed. If we wanted a traditional Catholic education, we'd go back to the classical liberal arts. And of course, that's what I'd recommend. And if we were concerned about modern requirements in our education, we would be looking at the goals, setting clear goals for education based on real-world modern requirements, and we'd be reverse engineering a modern program to prepare our children to satisfy those goals. And that's not what these K-12 modern homeschool programs are doing. They're simply cloning the public school system and selling products to a niche market of Catholic families who don't know what they're doing, and who I would argue are making a terrible mistake. Now, you can make all kinds of cases for these Catholic programs, but they're accidental to the homeschool programs. What I mean by that is, you can say, well, we use this or that Catholic homeschool program and we go to daily Mass. Going to daily Mass has nothing to do with any homeschool program. We say the Rosary every day. The private school doesn't say the Rosary every day. Our homeschool is better. I'll agree because you pray the Rosary every day, but it has nothing to do with your homeschool program. That's just your own family praying the Rosary. You can pray the Liturgy of the Hours at home. You can go to daily Mass. But that has nothing to do with the homeschool program. That has nothing to do with academics or formal education. That's simply family culture. And homeschool families have to be careful that they don't allow homeschool publishers to sell them their own family culture, and then to take credit for it as if the homeschool program is the cause of their religious activity, of their devotion, and so on. A homeschool program should be evaluated based exclusively on its ability to lead students to achieve academic goals. Catholic schools and colleges and homeschool programs do this all the time. They try to market the church and the sacraments and family culture as if the homeschool program has that to offer, when no one needs to send a student to college or to a private school or to purchase a homeschool curriculum to have their children engage in those benefits. They're available freely to everyone, every day, in every parish. And yet homeschool publishers market these things as if they're made possible by the homeschool program and not simply by the families themselves. The homeschool publishers and programs should be held accountable for what they enable students to achieve academically. And when we look at the results, they're not good. And that's why the homeschool publishers try to distract us from looking at those things. Seton is not going to show its average SAT scores compared to private school SAT scores because they know what the conclusion will be. They're going to make a misleading comparison with the national average that includes public schools. They're going to show pictures of the Eucharist. They're going to show pictures of churches and saints, even though those saints didn't study or teach anything like the Seton curriculum, but their images are being used to sell a homeschool program. No one needs to enroll in a Catholic homeschool program to enjoy the Eucharist. No one needs to enroll in a Catholic homeschool program to imitate the saints. And if you want to imitate the saints, at least as their academic life is concerned, you're not going to find that life in the modern Catholic homeschool programs. You're going to find the public school system dressed up to look Catholic. So what are the goals for a Catholic homeschool program? First of all, set all of your family religion aside, because that's your own life. That has nothing to do with your academic activity. And you need to make that separation so you don't get distracted by what you already have as you consider what you need for homeschooling. You need to provide your children with an education that's properly human. And that can only be done, and I'm going to say this very boldly and clearly, that can only be done, only, through the classical liberal arts. If you want to imitate the saints with regard to academics, then give your children the opportunity to study the classical liberal arts like the saints did. That's objective, historical fact. There are no saints who you will study who attended a K through 12 school and followed a curriculum that was like a modern public school based on science and math, intended only to prepare children for jobs. That's not how saints were educated. They were educated with the classical liberal arts. That's why there were so many religious among the saints. Nearly all the saints who are canonized lived in religious vocations. Of course, there were laymen who have been canonized, but even among them, we'll find men and women who studied and taught the classical liberal arts, like St. Thomas More. None of them had anything to do with a modern public school education. The first goal for your Catholic homeschool should be to give your children a truly human, intellectual education, and that can only be provided through the classical liberal arts. Secondly, to prepare your children for modern vocations. Now, if your children choose a religious vocation, there's nothing else for you to do. Live out your Catholic life, attend Mass regularly, make frequent use of the sacraments, pray as a family regularly, cultivate faithful devotions, give your children a classical liberal arts education, and you'll have a child ready for religious life. But if your children choose a secular vocation, you're going to want to prepare them for success in that vocation so they're not tempted to all kinds of evil through a stressed out life trying to earn a living without skill in a secular vocation. I came to this realization when I was in college. I may have shared this story in other talks, but I was watching a performance of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra and saw a piccolo player. And as I watched this piccolo player, I said to myself, that man at some point had to choose to be one of the best piccolo players in America. And he went all in on his piccolo practice. And now that he's identified as the best piccolo player, I don't know if there's a more technical term for one who plays the piccolo, but he has a career playing the piccolo because he's the best at it. And the reason why mastery in a craft is important is because it allows the master to set the terms for his work. He can be self-employed, for example, and enjoy a schedule of work that doesn't compromise his life in the church or obedience to the commandments. It's important if a student chooses to enter into secular occupations that he study to be skilled in them, or he'll find himself in trouble. And this is what causes many children trouble. They enter into secular society and they're not highly skilled, and therefore they're desperate for work. And they begin accepting any conditions they can find. And before you know it, they're no longer going to Mass even on Sundays because they, quote unquote, have to work. And for them, in their circumstances, it's true. Because they lack any skill, because they're not masters in any field, they have to take whatever's available. And those jobs, those low-level, unskilled jobs, come with conditions that are miserable. And so if our children do decide to pursue secular vocations, we want to make sure we emphasize to them the importance of becoming a master of whatever craft or field it is that they choose to pursue. Part of that is, if a certain profession requires a college degree, gaining admission to the most selective college, the best possible program they can, to again separate them from the competition in a capitalist marketplace. So college admission is, contrary to what many Catholics say, college admission is very important. Being admitted to an impressive, a highly reputable college or university program is very important. Because in our economy, one has to separate himself from the competition. That's just how it works. And so we have to look at college admission and ask, not what do I need to do to start studies at the local community college, just so I can check the box and get a college degree, as if that's how it works, because that's not how it works. Getting any college degree doesn't fulfill the purpose of going to college. In order to gain admission to a selective university that's going to provide a student with an excellent education, with lots of connections in the field that he wishes to pursue, possibly to prepare him for further studies in graduate or professional schools, he's going to need to know what it takes to get admitted to a top school. And when we look and see what's required, we see that selective universities want students who have 4 years of high school study in 5 subject areas: English, mathematics, science, history, and foreign language. They want 4 years of study in each of those 5 subject areas. That needs to be reverse engineered and set in place by the time a student is in 8th grade. Even earlier than that, students have the opportunity in their earlier years to get a head start on those studies, to lay a foundation of intellectual achievement that allows them to hit the ground running, as it were, by the time they reach high school age. They've got to complete those modern academic requirements and do so with excellence. And so if we were to set secular goals for education, I would recommend a system of concentric circles. And the first circle would be, we need to focus on high school diploma and transcript studies. And they have to be taken care of. There's no need for a K-12 program to do this. It's simply 5 subject areas that require 4 years of study. And there's a normal set of subjects to be pursued. And the public school curriculum doesn't provide sufficiently for these to be pursued for students interested in selective universities. Students are going to have to go above and beyond what's available in public and private schools. And this is where homeschooling fails. The first circle, I'd say, is high school diploma and transcript studies. The second circle is standardized tests. No one has any clue what a student does in a homeschool, and no one cares. When a college asks for a diploma or for a transcript, they're simply looking to see that all bases have been covered. They may ask for a grade point average, but again, that's simply procedural. They're not going to admit a kid who's got a 2.4 GPA. They're going to look and see that it's 3.5, 3.6 or higher on a scale of 4.0 because they publish these statistics at the university. They're not going to admit kids who cause their numbers to go down. They're looking for kids who pump up their numbers, as it were. But standardized tests are where they look to see what's really going on. And when I say standardized tests, I mean 4 different things, possibly 5. The first standardized test they look at is obviously the SAT. Anyone who tells you that the SAT doesn't matter is lying to you. The first score is going to be the SAT, and students need high scores on the SAT to even be considered for selective universities. And a high score, I would say, is 1,400 and above. Another standardized test is the ACT. But in addition to these college entrance examinations, there are also AP exams and SAT subject tests. An SAT subject test is just what it says. It's a test made by the makers of the SAT that tests student knowledge of high school subjects. It's an opportunity to demonstrate through a standardized test a student's mastery of a subject. The same thing is true of AP exams. They're called advanced placement exams. They're college-level exams for high school students that allow students to demonstrate that they're capable of studying at a college level. That's the second circle that students have to focus on in homeschooling. Standardized tests. They have to demonstrate that they're not just mommy's baby sitting at home coloring books, doing the normal homeschool silliness that everyone rightly criticizes, but they're actually doing academic work that's above and beyond what's being done in the public schools or in private schools, or which is, characteristically associated with homeschooling. That's the second circle, standardized testing. Homeschool students should prepare for and take as many standardized tests as they can, because if they can score well on standardized tests, it takes away all objections to homeschooling. Beyond that, the third circle, if a student wants to go further, I would recommend adding to that educational plan, that college admission-based educational plan, classical studies. But not wandering, certainly not what modern schools call classical studies. I'm talking about real classical liberal arts studies, real classical philosophy studies. And what I'd recommend for any student who's interested in admission to a selective university who wants to pursue classical studies in the right way is to look at the tutorial program on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website, where a student would actually work with me to complete a set of objectives, and as a reward for completing those objectives, he'll earn a letter of recommendation from me as an expert tutor, certifying his ability and his character in these extraordinary studies. To add that to a high school transcript, to add that to a college application, will certainly separate a student from the competition. And again, if you don't like the idea of competition, then you have to realize you're talking about secular occupations. We're not talking about religious life. We're talking about the secular marketplace, and you better help your child understand that the whole point of the secular market is competition. I don't think that's something Christians need to be afraid of, but it's something that Christians have to address realistically. You want to compete and enter secular vocations? Hey, I'm game for that. I'd be happy to help students prepare for that. But you've got to be willing to go above and beyond and do the work that's necessary to enter into that competition. Otherwise, what we'll see kids do is simply use secular occupations as an excuse to not pursue religious vocations. They'll say, oh no, I'm not interested in religious vocation. I'd like to get married. Married and do what? Compete in the workplace. That's what you're going to be doing. And it's only going to get more competitive, much more competitive. And I'm not saying that to promote any anxiety or stress, but it's just it's reality. Business is challenging. You have to work. It's competitive. It's your product and your service against someone else's in a free market. So the first circle that I mentioned for secular occupations as far as academic goals is to get all of the high school diploma and transcript requirements laid out. Then lay out plans to prepare for standardized testing, SAT, ACT, AP exams, SAT subject tests. Then beyond that, to look at the option for a tutorial relationship in extraordinary studies where a student shows, this is what colleges are looking for, selective colleges, they're looking to see that a student seeks out the most challenging course of studies available to him. And the tutoring program in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy provides for that. And then outside of that, I would say more zealous pursuits of Catholic studies in terms of things like the Summa Theologica, sacred scripture studies, and so on. But those four concentric circles, starting from high school diploma and transcript requirements, extending to standardized tests for college admission, extending to classical studies with tutorial direction and accountability, leading to a formal letter of recommendation to be included with the student's application materials, and then going beyond that and enriching one's Catholic education for professional application and use, to actually do the work of the laity and direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. That's the purpose of the laity. That's real Catholic secular vocations. So, in that previous talk, I discussed silly, childish Catholic homeschool goals and why homeschooling like that never works. In this talk, I've laid out for you what more respectable, what more responsible, more realistic, more reasonable homeschool goals should look like, and how we can set those goals put them on the table and then reverse engineer to lay out and plan a responsible, high-achieving Catholic homeschool plan for our families. Of course, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is the only program that can serve and help families through all of those circles. Whether it's preparing for religious vocations or preparing for secular vocations, accepting the challenges of the competitive secular workplace, and rather than mocking it or saying it's not important, rather overcoming it and succeeding in it, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is the only program that even can pretend to offer a solution to Catholic students in all of these areas. So I hope that's helpful in seeing more clearly what goals should be. And if you'd like to get into those things in detail, all the help you need is available, but you've got to make use of it. You've got to take initiative as a homeschool parent. You've got to reach out. You've got to get started. And you've got to be willing to work one step at a time, starting at the beginning, doing the work required of each step, and then working to understand and fulfill the objectives of each subsequent step. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to end up with this modern homeschool mess. And you're going to surround yourself with people who think it's cool to unschool their children, who try to pretend that somehow Christianity causes you to do less rather than more. And I just ask you to pay attention to the things that people say around you and ask, is it really true that homeschooling our children should actually lead to lower achievement, worse behavior, lower standards, less success, and so on? Or are we simply gathering together and lying to one another and pretending that what we're doing is right when the fruits are troublesome? When we're surrounded by red flags telling us that things are wrong, and we're just arrogantly laughing at them as if our failures are actually a sign of what great Christians we are. I hope that this talk challenges you, but I want to challenge you in a way that also offers hope, because there are ways and there are means for you to succeed in these things. But you've got to take the first steps. God bless.